I don't pay the cleaning lady to think. I pay her to disappear. This was Alejandro Torres's unwritten motto, and the law that governed his cold, million-dollar Bel Air mansion. At 4:30 a.m., the blue light of his smartphone was the only dawn he recognized, illuminating the cold marble and bare walls of his suite. His fortune, built on algorithms and the ruthless acquisition of startups. It looked like an expensive, tailored suit, but invisibly tight, suffocating any trace of human warmth. He stood, the shadow projected on the mirrored wall seeming taller and lonelier than he actually was, the silence of the mansion swallowing the sound of his footsteps. Breakfast was always the same, espresso triple, smoothie green, and reading dozens of emails about mergers and acquisitions worth more than the gross domestic product of small countries. The long, gleaming dining table, made of a single piece of imported volcanic glass, never had guests. He ate standing up, hurriedly, as if each bite meant delaying the next transaction. His ostentation wasn't to impress others, but to fill an inner hole that all the money in the world couldn't fill, a void he disguised with his relentless pursuit of more power. The only pause in his robotic ritual was a brief stop in front of his son Gael's room. 10 years old, the autistic boy lived in a private universe, protected by padded walls and absolute silence, a luxurious cage Alejandro had built to ensure the best treatment. He didn't enter. He didn't knock. He simply stared through the crack in the door, feeling a mixture of paralyzing guilt and a desperate inability to connect with the child who barely recognized him. The driver, dressed in an impeccable charcoal gray uniform, waited for the tycoon at the main entrance, next to the fleet of luxury cars that looked like polished metal sculptures. Alejandro descended the monumental staircase without looking away, his tie perfectly aligned, his face a mask of corporate invincibility that allowed no cracks. The exit was always already seen cold, the wrought iron gate opening onto the vastness of Los Angeles, the promise of another day of relentless negotiations and hollow victories. He didn't miss home because there was no home to miss. That day, the routine was shattered by a curt text message. The meeting with Asian investors had been postponed due to a bureaucratic setback in Hong Kong. A cold fury settled over Alejandro. He hated unexpected events that disrupted the rhythm of his controlled life. His frustration was so great that, instead of retreating to another office, he ordered his driver to take him back to the mansion, a place he rarely stayed before 9 o'clock at night. He crossed the grand entrance hall, the marble echoing with the pent-up anger in his footsteps. The usual silence was there, heavy and oppressive, but there was something different, a subtle anomaly that his hyperactive mind quickly detected. A noise. It wasn't the loud classical music the servants were instructed to play to calm Gael. It was something else, something that seemed alive, melodic, yet simultaneously moving and unexpected amidst so much coldness. The sound came from the music room, the room that housed the Steinway D grand piano he'd bought simply because it fit the décor. The door was ajar. Alejandro approached, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of irritation and curiosity, his businessman's mask beginning to crumble in the face of the domestic mystery. The music was soft, a simple melody, but soulful, something that would never belong in that mansion. He pushed open the oak door. The scene that unfolded was impossible, a breaking of every unwritten rule of that icy empire. At the center of the sterile luxury stood her, the cleaner. Maria del Carmen Reyes, the invisible woman who cleaned away the traces of her hurried life, was there, leaning over the autistic child who barely spoke. Carmen, hunched over, her brow furrowed in concentration, murmured in soft, rhythmic Spanish, a whisper that sounded like an ancient incantation. Gael sat quietly, his eyes fixed on her, a new calm in his usually troubled expression. The sight was a picture of clandestine intimacy, of a human touch he, her father, had never been able to offer. Alejandro felt the air leave his lungs, The scene was so powerful it paralyzed him. The woman he could barely see was doing the impossible, what all the expensive therapists had failed to do. She was calming his son, but it wasn't just calming. There was a connection, an invisible thread of tenderness connecting them. He clenched his fists, his initial anger turning into profound shock. But one simple afternoon would change everything. What he saw in the room left him speechless. Maria del Carmen Reyes would wake up in the frigid darkness of her small apartment in Boyle Heights, long before the Los Angeles sun began to burn. Her routine was a ritual of silent sacrifice: weak coffee, stale bread, and a soft kiss on her daughter's forehead. Ximena, 12 years old, who slept curled up, oblivious to her mother's toil. That modest room, with the flickering light of the Virgin of Guadalupe, was the warm and suffering center of her universe, the only place where she was Mary and not just the maid. The journey to Bel Air was a crossing of worlds, from the scent of spices and Mexican humility to the sterile opulence and perfectly manicured lawns of the wealthy. Carmen arrived at Alejandro Torres's mansion like a shadow, wearing the faded uniform that was her invisibility cloak, a 42-year-old woman who had traded the stage for a mop. She moved with the grace of someone who knew her presence was tolerated but never acknowledged, a ghost cleaning up the filth and excess of other people's lives. Her daily task was to sweep away the traces of Alejandro's haste, the crumbs forgotten on the marble of the chef's kitchen, the dust that dared to settle on the modern art sculptures, the cold disorder of a life lived in constant movement but without direction. She observed the opulence with the serenity of someone who doesn't envy, but laments the emptiness that so much luxury fails to fill. Money for Carmen was what was needed for Ximena's medicine and to maintain her dignity. Gael's room was the only place where she broke the protocol of professional indifference. As she cleaned the high-tech toys he never touched and vacuumed the sound-dampening carpet, she whispered Spanish words into the air, short prayers and promises of tenderness. She felt his loneliness as if it were her own, recognizing the same in him. Silent fight of her own daughter, the same need for a touch that wasn't medical or cold. She touched the grand piano with her fingertip, feeling the instrument's precious wood and slumbering soul, remembering the concert halls in Germany where her talent was her currency. Music was her pain and her salvation, a secret she guarded like a profane treasure in that house where art was merely decoration. She had given up her dream to save her parents and now to care for Ximena. What kept her going was not the few $100s she received at the end of the month, but the dignity with which she performed her work. She cleaned every corner with the same precision she used to perform a sonata, honoring her sacrifice. She was more than a cleaner. She was an artist in exile, a warrior mother who silently watched the Torres family crumble under the weight of her own money. Secretly, over the past few weeks, she had noticed Gael's deteriorating condition. She had a gift, a heightened empathy developed over the years with Ximena, to understand the subtlest signs of the autism spectrum. Alejandro's doctors were excellent, but they lacked something fundamental: a heart. And Carmen had a heart that beat at the rhythm of sacrifice. She often left little accidents in Gael's room, a flower from the garden, a small sweet she brought from home, or a hummed melody. And the boy would respond with a slight averted glance, a small crack in her armor of isolation. These were small acts of rebellion and charity, committed knowing that at any moment she could be caught and dismissed without ceremony. That day, as she folded the soft, expensive towels, she heard the front door close with more force than usual, a sign that Alejandro had left. She sighed with relief, ready for her invisible routine, which would allow her an hour of solitude to think about Ximena and how to arrange the next experimental treatment for her. She needed the work, but she hated the invisibility it imposed on her. Carmen moved into the main hall, picking up the vacuum cleaner. The house was a museum, a sanctuary of marble and glass, where real life seemed banished. She was alone, in her realm of invisible filth, ready to fulfill her role as a silent shadow until she could return to her neighborhood and her daughter. She didn't know that the order of the mansion's universe was about to be revoked. She stopped. Her eyes moved to the piano, and an irresistible urge, a repressed artistic desire, assaulted her. She needed that touch, that escape that reminded her of who she truly was. She knelt and closed her eyes for a moment. She held secrets that would change the fate of her family. Beyond the dust, she swept away. Alejandro was furious. The cancellation of the Hong Kong meeting wasn't just a logistical setback. It was an insult to his rigorous schedule, a failure of control he couldn't tolerate. He ordered his driver to take him back to the mansion, planning to drown himself in emails and conference calls, turning his anger into ruthless productivity. Home was the only place he could work without interruption. Upon entering, the mansion welcomed him with its usual, oppressive silence. It was a precious, sealed silence, which he wore as proof of his order and control. He threw his designer jacket onto the white velvet sofa, an act of disrespect no employee would have dared commit, feeling the weight of his own loneliness. Indifference was his shield. He was heading toward the office, his hard footsteps on the marble echoing the irritation in his chest, when the silence broke. It wasn't the sound of a dishwasher or a vacuum cleaner. It was something subtler and more melodic, seeming out of tune with the cold architecture of the place. It was music, a soft but deeply felt music, a cadence he couldn't quite place. Alejandro stood in the middle of the great hall, his brow furrowed. The servants had strict instructions to maintain silence while he was home, or to play only European classical music. That melody, however, seemed to come from somewhere else. More organic, warmer, with a pulse that resembled that of a heart, something he had banished from his life. Curiosity, a rare and disturbing feeling for the focused tycoon, pulled him to the opposite side of the house, toward the music room. The room was a display sanctuary, a silent stage for the Steinway piano that had cost the price of a downtown apartment, a piece that had never been truly played since its purchase. He felt a twinge of irritation. Who was violating his space? He stopped at the oak door. The door was slightly open, allowing the music to leak out like warm steam. It was a piano melody that wasn't classical but popular, with a rhythm that suggested dance or lullaby. It was strange, inappropriate, and filled him with a sense of familiarity that made him uncomfortable. The tycoon pushed open the door with an uncharacteristic caution. He expected to find one of the janitors relaxing, perhaps, or the gardener trying to impress the cook. He was ready for the cold, professional rebuke, the immediate cut that would restore order. His posture was judgmental, but the scene that unfolded was not one worthy of a simple dismissal. Standing in the center of the room next to the piano was Carmen, the cleaning lady, in her charcoal gray uniform, an unexpected figure on that luxurious stage. But she wasn't the center of his shocked attention. Gael was there. The boy, who seemed made of glass and lived in a world of his own, was standing just a few feet away from Carmen. She was singing, in a rhythmic Spanish whisper, a melody that seemed like a gentle invitation. And to Alejandro's horror and amazement, Gael was moving your head. It wasn't a movement of crisis or anguish. It was a gentle sway, a rhythmic movement that Carmen set with her arms. Gael's eyes were fixed on Carmen's face, and most importantly, there was no fear, no retreat, but unprecedented calm in the always disturbed child. Alejandro's pulse quickened. The tycoon, who had closed billions in deals, felt completely disarmed. The woman he paid to mop his floors was doing what years of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. She was reaching his son. Silence returned, broken only by the whispered melody. What he saw in the room left him speechless. The silence of his life was about to be shattered by forbidden music. The air in the music room froze for Alejandro. He couldn't move or speak, just watch, breaking all the rules of her home and her heart. Carmen, once the shadow, was now the center of attention, murmuring a cumbias muth, a rhythm he would never have allowed in his playlist of classical music. The sound was humble and cheerful, strange in that luxurious environment. The tycoon was used to seeing Gael as a complex problem, a medical puzzle to be solved with the best specialists and medicine. Now, the solution came not from a multi-million-dollar contract, but from a woman in a gray uniform with a simple rhythm, from his native Mexico. The contrast hit him like a punch. His money had failed where his humanity Carmen triumphed. Carmen, who had not yet noticed her boss's presence, smiled at Gael, her eyes full of maternal tenderness, which the boy seemed to absorb like a balm. She held Gael's little hands, guiding him in a gentle rocking motion, a movement that required no words, just trust and contact. The most shocking thing was her son's face. Gael was not isolated. He was present. His blue eyes, usually dull and lost, followed Carmen with acute concentration. And then it happened. Asmile. A fleeting smile, uncertain but genuine. The first expression of pure joy Alejandro had seen on his son's face in months, perhaps years. His father felt a sharp pang of jealousy and gratitude at the same time. The music stopped. Carmen sighed, turning to the door with a start as she felt the weight of someone's gaze. Her eyes widened when she saw Alejandro Torres standing there, the embodiment of cold authority, his face pale and impassive, but his eyes betraying an emotional storm. The silence returned, heavy and sharp, shattering the spell. Carmen's face took on an expression of humiliating resignation. She knew she had been caught, that she had violated the invisible boundary between employee and family member. She expected the shouting, the threat, the immediate dismissal that would condemn her to find another job to support Jimena. She was ready to accept the punishment for having dared to be human. Alejandro, meanwhile, was trying to process the image of his son smiling in the cleaning lady's arms, a scene that shattered his control-based philosophy of life. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation for who she thought he was, but the words stuck in his throat. He felt dismissal from power in the face of that simple display of affection. The silence was unbearable. Gael, sensing the tension, retreated into himself again, letting go of Carmen's hand and shrinking back a little, the light on his smile fading. Reality, cold and brutal, returned to the mansion, reminding everyone of the gulf in class and emotions between them. Carmen stepped forward, ready to plead. She would give up her salary, anything, if he would just understand that there was no malice in her actions, only the need to care. But Alejandro shook his head, not in denial, but in confusion. He didn't know what to think. He watched the way Carmen lowered her head, accepting her impending humiliation. She was ready to be treated like a mistake to be corrected, but he had just seen the salvation of his son. Reason and heart were waging a furious battle within the magnate. It was as if she spoke her son's secret language, a dialect of affection that he, the father, was doomed not to understand. The tension was so intense that Carmen felt a cold sweat run down her back. She expected Alejandro to throw her out of the room, but he simply pointed to the grand piano without saying a word. His eyes demanded an explanation for the soft melody that had just ceased. The piano, a symbol of Alejandro's quiet ostentation, would now be the stage for his hidden truth. With a last look at Gael, who had already turned his back, lost in his protective world, Carmen approached the Steinway D. The polished, cold wood reflected her tired face, but her eyes shone with a sudden courage. She sat down on the leather stool and hesitated for a second, feeling the weight of all her years of sacrifice on her fingers. The first touch was hesitant, a soft arpeggio, like the sound of water falling into a lake. Then Carmen's hands, which minutes before had been scrubbing the marble floor, moved with impeccable technique and unrepressed passion. She began to play Chopin. Not a mechanical performance, but a nocturne who seemed to weep over the pain and beauty of his exiled life. The room transformed. The sound was rich, complex, and melancholic, filling the emptiness of the mansion with an unexpected and overwhelming beauty. Alejandro was transfixed. This wasn't the work of an amateur, it was the work of a virtuoso, of someone whose soul was connected to music on a deep level. The tycoon, who understood value, recognized the preciousness of that talent. He looked at Carmen's hands, wondering how many times those same hands had been applauded in European theaters, and how they were now covered in detergent. Humiliation was no longer hers. It was his. He had treated a first-rate artist like a mere cleaning lady, not even bothering to ask her last name. Carmen's touch was so expressive that it seemed to tell her story. The promise of a bright future, the abrupt end to her career, the weight of responsibility, the sacrificial love. The sound enveloped Gael, who slowly turned and approached the piano, mesmerized. The boy reached out hesitantly toward the strings, not in destruction, but in curiosity. Carmen kept her cool, slightly shifting the melody to a softer, more playful tone, inviting interaction. Gael, for the first time, interacted with the world out of her isolation, gently touching a key, producing a dissonant but real sound. The sound of the piano transformed into a conversation between the artist and the boy. The music stopped. Carmen took her hands off the piano and looked at Alejandro, the truth now exposed, without the need for words. She was a classical pianist training, and he had reduced her to cleaning toilets. Alejandro's shame was palpable, mixed with bewilderment at how so much talent had been hidden in his home. He felt invaded, not by the cleaning lady, but by the woman. His controlled life had been exposed by a melody of pain and art. The piano, which had previously been an expensive piece of decoration for him, had been rescued from its silence by that woman, revealing the soul that had been missing from his entire life. The cleaning lady wasn't who she seemed. That piano, which served only as an ornament, revealed a story of sacrifice and art that he needed to unravel immediately. Alejandro stared at Carmen, his unshakable tycoon facade cracking under the weight of the cleaning lady's unexpected talent. The music still echoed in the silence, and he needed order, logic, an explanation that could fit this reality into his controlled life. "What does this mean, Carmen? Who are you?" His voice was low, dangerous, but the authority had been replaced by humiliating confusion. Carmen rose from her stool, facing her boss with a dignity that overshadowed her uniform. She was no longer in a supplicant position. The music had empowered her. "It means, Mr. Torres, that not all talent is measured by the money you have," he replied in formal Spanish, his pronunciation perfect, without the popular accent he used when cleaning, revealing his elite education. The contrast between the cleaning lady and the virtuoso was a punch to the gut for Alejandro. He demanded the truth, using a tone of corporate interrogation. Carmen relented, not out of fear, but to honor herself and her sacrifice. She revealed her journey, the conservatory in Germany, the prizes, the promise of a European career which was brutally interrupted by his parents' illness. Her story was an antithesis to Alejandro's life. She had exchanged stardom for duty, the Vienna stage by the broom in Los Angeles, all to pay for the medical treatment of his elderly parents in Mexico. His piano, now a piece of furniture in his small apartment, was a constant reminder of his dream shattered in the name of love and family responsibility. "I am Maria del Carmen Reyes, Mr. Torres, classical pianist, graduated with honors, and now your employee," she declared, the last word laden with cutting irony. Alejandro's wealth, which had employed her, was suddenly insignificant compared to the inner richness and sacrifice she represented. Alejandro staggered. He was the master of the technology world, but he was being exposed in his own home. He had spent fortunes on art and culture, and the greatest artistic talent of his life was scrubbing his toilets. The realization of injustice and his own blindness hit him hard. He tried to regain control, talking about the breach of contract and the lack of professionalism, but the words rang hollow. Gail's face, now confused by the rising tension, was a stronger reminder than any legal clause of who was truly in control of the situation. "I'm not here to steal anything, Mr. Torres," Carmen said, her voice firm. "I was simply allowing the silence of this house to be broken. And more importantly, I was trying to reach your son, which all your expensive doctors can't seem to achieve." Carmen's boldness, her naked truth, disarmed Alejandro. He realized she wasn't bragging about her past, but justifying her intuitive method with Gael. She wasn't just a cleaning lady, she was a woman of culture, with a depth that he, in his bubble of money, had ignored. Alejandro's initial anger turned into a desperate curiosity. He knew he had to listen to her. That the secret to Gail's smile wasn't in hospitals, but in that woman's story of pain and love. He was at the limit of his arrogance. He realized he never knew who lived next door to him. The talent he bought was actually cleaning up his mess, and that truth would hurt far more than the music. Alejandro gestured for Carmen to sit, an unusual gesture of recognition. He looked at her, no longer as a maid, but as someone who held the map to his son's lost territory. "Tell me about Gael," he ordered, his voice now less that of a boss and more that of a desperate father. Carmen didn't hesitate. She had crossed the line, and now she wasn't going back. She didn't talk about medicine or therapies. She talked about souls. "Gail's problem is not a lack of doctors, Mr. Towers, but lack of presence," she began, the accusation soft but lethal. She pointed to the emptiness of the living room, the coldness of the marble, the untouched toys. "This house is a museum. It's perfect, but it's not a home. Gael lives in emotional abandonment, which is more painful than his autistic condition," he said, cutting Alejandro's heart with surgical precision. The tycoon flinched. Her words were sharper than any Wall Street critique. He was a father who had hidden behind money, buying the best for his son, but denying him the most essential, himself. His empire had been built on parental neglect. Carmen continued, laying out the evidence. She described how Gael reacted to the sound of Alejandro's voice, anxiety and loneliness that he emitted whenever his father was around, as if he were a noisy stranger in the boy's life. She saw the boy as her equal, and he saw her son as a charitable project. "You medicated him, admitted him to intensive care, but you never saw for real," she whispered. "What he needs is a father who feels, who touches, who isn't afraid to be imperfect, who doesn't treat his son like a flawed luxury item." Alejandro felt completely disarmed. He had failed. He had blamed autism, doctors, even genetics, but the truth was in his hands. Daily absence, in his priority for business over the life of his only son. The shame was overwhelming. He tried to defend himself, citing work, the need to maintain the empire, the legacy. Carmen simply cut him off with a look of pure pity. "The legacy, Mr. Torres, is in your son. Money can't buy time and cannot heal the heart of a child." Gael's wound was, in fact, Alejandro's wound. Carmen had turned the tables, transforming the confrontation over his identity into a brutal diagnosis of empty life of the tycoon. He realized he was trading his soul for wealth he couldn't use to save the ones he loved most. The silence was a confession. Alejandro's pride crumbled. He stood before the woman who cleaned his windows, and she had just given him the hardest and most precious truth of his life. He needed more. He needed to know what she knew. Her words cut Alejandro like a blade, hitting the most sensitive point of his pride, the realization that he was the greatest obstacle to his own son's happiness. Alejandro was on his knees, figuratively, before Carmen. He was absorbing the diagnosis of his fatherly failure and needed more. He needed Themthid, the secret behind Gael's smile. How do you know all this? Where does this connection with him?" he asked, his voice husky, stripped of its usual arrogance. Carmen took a deep breath. knowing the next revelation was the most intimate and dangerous. It was the key that justified every touch, every whisper in Spanish, every moment she had spent with his son. She looked at Gael, who was now sitting peacefully, oblivious to the tense conversation between the adults. "I didn't study expensive psychology books, Mr. Torres. I studied at home. I studied the pain and light of a child who is just like yours," she confessed. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Her daughter's sacrifice was what gave her the moral authority to be there. With a choked voice, she uttered the word that would seal the connection between their lives. "My daughter, Jimena, is 12 years old and is also on the autism spectrum." The shock was visible on Alejandro's face. His cleaning lady was not only a pianist, but also a mother who fought the same silent battle as he did. She explained that the methods she used with Gael, the soft folk music, the rhythmic beats, the touch that didn't require eye contact, were born of years off trial and error with Jimena. They were mother's tricks, not those of a therapist, born of desperate love and need. "When I clean this house, I listen to your therapists. They talk about goals, about analysis, about results. I speak the language of fear, sensory overload, and need for a hug," Carmen said. She was using the experience of her own pain to heal his son. Carmen's humility was a mirror of your own blindness. While he spent fortunes on cutting-edge therapies, the answer was all along in the house, in the life experience of a woman who had nothing but love and a deep understanding of the condition. Alejandro felt like a fool. He had treated Jimena like a statistical problem, a ghost in a poor neighborhood, unaware that her life was giving him free and sacrificial form, the key to his own son. The gap between their social classes seemed to be suddenly closed by their shared grief. Carmen's confession was more than a revelation. It was a final accusation against Alejandro's cynicism. He had not only underestimated the woman who served him, he had ignored the most valuable lesson of his life, which came from the humble but courageous life of his Mexican mother. She finished her confession by looking directly at Gael and then at the tycoon. "I understand your son, mister. And what I do is just what I would like others to do for my Jimena. See beyond the diagnosis and just love. It was she who, in secret and out of sacrificial love, had been changing Gael's life. And the final revelation she kept hidden would be the strongest blow to his father's soul." Alejandro was processing Jimena's bombshell when Carmen continued, taking the revelation to its most painful point. The silence in the music room was tense, the atmosphere charged with unspoken truths and the memory of deceased wife, Gael's mother, whose emptiness was the source of the coldness in the mansion. "There is something else, Mr. Torres. Something you need to know, even if it hurts," Carmen said, her voice barely above a whisper. She approached Gael and placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder, preparing Alejandro for the final blow of his humiliation. She revealed that in recent weeks, during Gael's moments of greatest crisis or anguish, when he felt overwhelmed and unable to communicate, she would hold him and speak to him in Spanish. In response, the boy would utter a single, powerful word. "Gael, he calls me Mommy." The confession was like a knife to Alejandro's heart. He shivered, not with anger at the woman, but with shock and shame. The words his son should have addressed to his dead mother or to him in remembrance were being used for the cleaning lady. The void left by his wife had been filled, not by a therapist or a new, wealthy female figure, but by an invisible woman who was vacuuming. The tycoon had been replaced in the most intimate of bonds, the one that connects a child to its comforting maternal figure. The shock turned into a quiet rage, a rage directed at himself. He had closed himself off so much in the pain of widowhood and his obsession with work that he had allowed. Her son's heart was kidnapped by a stranger, a person whose full name he barely knew. Carmen wasn't bragging. She was sharing a pain and a responsibility that did not belong to her. She understood that the name was not Forsha physically, but for the function of warmth, security, and unconditional love that she provided in a cold home. Alejandro felt the weight of guilt, the confession that he had utterly failed to protect his wife's heart and memory, and that he had failed to give his son the continuity of a mother's love. Money couldn't buy the affection Carmen naturally radiated. He looked at Gael, who looked happy and secure beside Carmen. The boy wasn't betraying his father. He was seeking emotional survival to the person who offered it, and the person who offered it was the cleaning lady, the woman he paid not to be seen. The scene was the embodiment of his failure. The man who dominated the business world could not control the emotions of his son or his home. Carmen's confession was the turning point which required a radical and immediate change. The void left by his dead mother had been filled by the cleaning lady. That name, Mommy, spoken to her, was the hardest blow to his heart, forcing him to make a choice, either his pride or his son. The silence after the word Mommy was deathly. Alejandro took a long minute to compose himself. The businessman, accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions in seconds, was now paralyzed by the incalculable force of love. He looked at Carmen and, for the first time, saw her as one, partner, not a subordinate. Carmen's pain and truth forced action. He stood up, went to his desk, and picked up the phone, not to call his lawyer or his bank, but to cancel the meeting that would fly him to Tokyo the next morning, a deal worth his company's reputation. The emptiness in his chest was more pressing than his schedule. Alejandro turned to Carmen, the mask of coldness replaced by a desperate vulnerability. "I failed, Carmen. I failed Gael and my wife's memory," he admitted, the hardest words he had ever spoken. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, but for help. He grabbed a pen and notepad. The tycoon, who treated people as assets and liabilities, was trying to translate affection into contractual terms. He proposed the unthinkable: revoke your role as cleaning lady and hire her as Gail's official therapist and caregiver with a salary that exceeded that of any executive. "I'll give you whatever it takes. The best salary, the best conditions. But you have to stay," he pleaded. He was willing to pay any price for that connection, that healing that money couldn't buy, but which he was now trying to acquire legally. Carmen stared at him, her eyes fixed on her pen and pad. She didn't crave the money. She craved dignity and well-being of her daughter. And above all, she feared that the conversion of her tenderness into a contract might break the spell with Gael, transforming love into a transaction. "My work with Gael cannot be paid, Mr. Torres. He's driven by the heart, not by clauses," Carmen replied, her hesitation palpable. She feared that by accepting the money she would devalue the sacrifice, what he had done for Jimena, and the purity of his bond with the boy. The moral conflict was intense. The chance to give Jimena a better life versus the risk of corrupting love. Alejandro realized that she didn't need the money. She needed trust and a recognition of their value that went beyond the payroll. He put down his pen, understanding. "It's not a contract, Carmen. It's a vote. I'm not buying your loyalty. I'm begging for your help. Teach me to be the father Gael needs," he said, breaking the last barrier of his pride. Carmen looked at Gael, then at Alejandro. She saw the sincerity in supplication and the opportunity to support Jimena with honor, without the humiliation of manual labor. The choice was not about her, but about the lives of the two children. But she hesitates. Can a mother's trust and love be bought or won by a man who only knew how to use money to hide? Carmen accepted the vote of confidence, and the tension turned into a nervous anticipation. Alejandro knew he needed to prove his worth, not with a contract, but with actions. The first challenge was simple but monumental. He needed to get closer to Gael without the mediation of the cleaning lady. He sat awkwardly on the edge of the music room sofa. The tycoon, who was fluent in 5 languages and programming code, didn't know the simple language of paternal affection. He tried to talk about the piano, about the sound, but his words were cold and distant, not reaching Gael's universe. Carmen watched from afar, teaching him with her eyes, silence, patience, presence. She gestured for him not to speak, but just was. Alejandro tried to imitate Carmen's calm, taking deep breaths and simply observing his son, trying to enter the boy's sensory world. He picked up one of Gael's colorful building blocks, a toy of simple design, and began stacking them slowly, without requiring interaction or eye contact. He was learning to slow down, to shed his corporate rush, to live at his son's pace. Gael, who was initially wary of his father's massive, tense presence, watched the clumsy attempt. The lack of pressure was key. He saw his father there, vulnerable, and something new and powerful began to form in the boy's heart. Alejandro continued building the tower, a crooked, simple building, very different from the skyscrapers he had designed in his life. He smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile, not the forced business smile. He was failing gloriously as a builder, and it was beautiful. Gael moved. The boy reached out and touched Alejandro's hand. A light touch, electrifying. The tycoon froze, feeling his son's temperature for the first time. He didn't pull away, accepting the invasion of his personal space. The boy looked into Alejandro's eyes, a sustained eye contact, brief but profound. And then, amid the silence of that room that had become a home, Gael ventured, in a fragile and uncertain voice, the word he hadn't spoken since his mother's death. Dad. Alejandro broke down. The man who didn't cry at funerals or bankruptcies felt the tears flow, hot and uncontrollable. It wasn't just a word. It was the sound of your rescue, the recognition that he still had a chance, that his son's love was not lost. The barrier between father and son, built by years of absence and fear, began to crumble with just 2 syllables, and he knew he would never again be the cold man money had created. Gael's first daddy acted like an earthquake, destroying the cold foundations of Alejandro's life. His heart still in ecstasy, the tycoon turned to Carmen, not with the arrogance of a paymaster, but with humility of those who learn. He was ready to accept any advice, any step that would take him deeper into his son's life. It was then that Carmen made her boldest proposal. She spoke about her daughter, Jimena, and the Gael's need to connect with an equal. He needs someone who doesn't look at him with pity or as a mystery to be solved, but as a companion on this journey, he explained, his voice full of hope for both children. Alejandro, the man previously trusted only in elite circles, hesitated for a moment. Bring the autistic cleaning lady's daughter to your mansion. It was a complete breach of social protocol. Pride flared briefly, but was drowned out by the memory of Gael's smile. Jimena understands Gael's world in a way we never will, Carmen insisted. She wants to know him. She believes 2 children on the spectrum can help each other in a way no adult can. The proposal was a test of its actual acceptance. The tycoon surrendered. Bring her, bring Jimena. I need to see what money can't buy, he said, his voice filled with new determination. He was trading social status for emotional healing of his son, a price he would gladly pay. He imagined the meeting, the marble and glass mansion, the scene of meetings of board, turning into a therapeutic amusement park for 2 children from completely opposite worlds, united by an invisible thread of neurodiversity. Alejandro's decision was a final goodbye to his cold past. He wasn't just accepting Jimena into his home, he was accepting her Carmen's life completely, the sacrifice and cultural richness that she brought from the Mexican community. Carmen smiled, a smile of pure gratitude and relief. It was the assurance that her work would be done with honor, and that Jimena would have access to a safe environment. The new family was beginning to take shape, acceptance and empathy. Gael, as if feeling the energy of acceptance, picked up a small teddy bear and offered it to Carmen, assolent present of approval. The gesture symbolized the bridge that mother and daughter were about to build between their two worlds. Alejandro looked at the gesture and felt a renewed courage. He would no longer be the man who hid behind numbers. He would be a father who built bridges, not walls, accepting the complex and loving life that was entering his home. Could two children on the spectrum, from opposite worlds, heal together? Alejandro's next step would be proof of his complete surrender to love. The giant step came the next morning. Alejandro called his executive team and declared a 7-day hiatus period, a whole week without meetings, without emails, without the toxic pressure of Wall Street. The tech empire stopped so the father could begin. The shock to the company was worldwide, but for Alejandro, the shock was the unusual calm that took over the mansion. He exchanged his designer suit for casual, awkward clothes and headed to the kitchen, the place he least spent time. He was determined to learn to be a present father. Her new routine was revolutionary in its simplicity. Breakfast at the wooden table, not standing, slow walks in the garden, observing the flowers with Gael, and reading storybooks, her voice cracking from lack of practice. The first morning was a silent humiliation. He burned the toast, spilled the juice, and tried to read a book about dinosaurs with a robotic intonation. Gael watched him, confused by the clumsy attempt, but persistence from the father was a balm. Carmen, now his guide and teacher, instructed him with gestures and whispers. "Smell the coffee, mister. Feel the grass. Be here." She taught him that the most valuable wealth was sensory experience and mindfulness, something your money could never buy. Over the course of the week, things began to change. Alejandro learned the difference between Gael's expressions, recognizing signs of happiness and overwhelm. He discovered that most important conversations were those who had no words. He smelled the scrambled eggs, the warmth of the sun on his skin, and the comfortable weight of Gael nestled in his lap as they read. He discovered that true wealth, it wasn't in signed contracts, but in his son's morning smile. The week was a forced spiritual retreat, a detox from the world of appearances. The tycoon began to see the world through Gael's eyes, with a clarity and sensitivity that he had lost while building his empire. He allowed himself to cry again, remembering his wife with tenderness and acceptance. The pain was no longer an emptiness, but a hot memory that drove him to be a better father to the son she had left behind. By the end of the week, Alejandro was exhausted, but reborn. He was no longer a CEO, he was a broken and rebuilt father. The mansion no longer felt like a museum, but a place that smelled of home cooking and life. He discovered that wealth lay not in million-dollar contracts, but in simple breakfasts and his son's unexpected laughter. The next visit would bring the final healing. The morning of Jimena's visit was the most nervous of Alejandro's life, surpassing any product launch or condition. The house was spotless, but he worried that sterile perfection could scare the girl. He was ready to accept Carmen's daughter's judgment. Jimena arrived, small and watchful-eyed, holding her mother's hand, a little intimidated by the vastness of the place. Gael surprisingly didn't shy away. He looked at Jimena, and for the first time with a stranger, there was no fear, but curious recognition. The meeting was an eloquent silence. The two children, united by the same spectrum, needed no words. They sat on the floor and began to play with the blocks, communicating in a dialect of gestures and sounds, which Carmen and Alejandro watched with reverence. Alejandro, observing the immediate and pure bond, felt the presence of his deceased wife. He realized that the legacy she wanted were not actions or startups, but this human tapestry of love and acceptance. The mansion finally felt warm. That night, Alejandro made a gesture that sealed the new foundation of the house. Sitting in his office, he drafted a letter, not a contract, but a personal statement to Jimena, recognizing her not as a guest, but as an essential part of Gael's journey. The letter promised full support for her studies and treatment, not as charity, but as honor to Carmen's sacrifice. He was investing in the girl who had brought the quickest and truest healing to his son. Money was now a tool for love. He handed the letter to Carmen, who read it with tears in her eyes. She saw their redemption Alejandro's complete. The tycoon had bowed to humanity. The man who bought everything was finally offering love and unconditional recognition. The tycoon understood that family was not defined by blood or surname, but by presence, empathy, and courage to care each other. That quartet, Gael, Jimena, Carmen, and him, was unlikely family and indestructible. The man who bought everything with money now offered love and a future. The ice empire was heating up, preparing for the climax of Carmen's deferred dream. Months passed. Alejandro Torres's mansion was unrecognizable. There was laughter, creative chaos, and voices in Spanish and English blended into chaotic and happy harmony. Alejandro was a present father, and Carmen, now an educator and vital mother figure, had returned to music. With the unconditional support of Alejandro, who used his connections to leverage her talent, Carmen was no longer hidden. Her years of sacrifice were being honored. She was preparing to perform at Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, the pinnacle of his dream as a pianist. The night of the concert was electrifying. The stage awaited her, and she was wearing a simple but elegant evening dress, the antithesis of the gray uniform. She wasn't playing for fame, but as a testimony of gratitude and resilience. In the front row, sitting side by side, were Alejandro, Gael, and Jimena. The tycoon, with a proud heart, held Gael, who was wearing headphones to manage the overload, but was calm and attentive. Jimena smiled, happy for her mother's friend. Carmen began her performance. She played Chopin, the same melody that had revealed her secret in the mansion, but now the music was a celebration, not a lament. The notes were strong, full of soul, the story of his life sung through the piano. Alejandro watched his children. Gael, looking at his father, gave an approving smile. Jimena squeezed Gael's hand. At that moment, the tycoon knew he had won the only true wealth, love and humanity. The ovation was thunderous. Carmen stood, her eyes searching for the three in the front row. The recognition came not from the crowd, but from proud look of Alejandro, Gael's smile, and Jimena's happiness. Her sacrifice had returned as triumph. In the music, presence, and love that united Los Angeles and Guadalajara, they found true wealth, a new family. They learned that the greatest fortune is human connection, and that love is the only secret language that everyone understands. If Alejandro and Carmen's journey from empty luxury to richness of heart touched you, remember, transformation starts with the presence. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Look at who is invisible next to you and dare be vulnerable. The greatest legacy you can build is not of money, but of human connection and love. Share this story and subscribe to our channel. Leave your comment. What is the price of your presence in the life of the one you love?